everyone. Welcome to our biannual balance. How is everyone today? Has been a very strange year indeed. And 2023 was a remarkable year for Borg as well, because we successfully abandoned the Russia-Ukraine war. Our blog successfully closed the chapter, just like we promised 1 year ago on our biannual presentation. We leave behind a conflict that no longer represents a geopolitical balance between Russia and Belarus versus NATO members and allies, but economic spheres defined by private economic agents that work in pursuit of success at the expenses of the adversary country's economy and ideology. A perfect example is how money seized and assets apprehended from Russian oligarchs by Western authorities enter Eastern Europe economy via Ukraine. What will these new agents pursue, and how will the war between Russia and Ukraine be a token of financial speculation? Will it be through hedge funds? I suppose a simplistic view that will finance lobbies with influence in Russian national politics and engage hedge funds that award profits to economic agents investing in military equipment is not welcome at this point in time, because the conflict is anything but simple. A more complex view of the matter will handle the Eastern Bloc that was once USSR as a two bloc that went from rags to riches and became Russia. This view will ignore substantial progress made by Russia at the social state level and focus specifically on the international importance of Russia abroad, and how such importance was severely severed by the legal framework imposed on Russian international partners and military trade allies, and how Wagner mercenaries were tainted with scandal after scandal and buried with a weak attempt to undermine President Putin's presidency. Perhaps this is a magnified view of what is happening to Russia at the global level. Yes, that Russia is being buried alive culturally, historically, economically, and morally. But what about at home? Can war and will war mean economic crash for Russia, or Russian economy and financial agents can circumvent being substituted regionally by rising economic forces that can isolate, insulate, and make Russia insignificant in the near future? Lately, I have been obsessed with RTS, Serbia TV channel. I'm amazed at how Serbians are obsessed with inflation and their in-depth coverage of Russia's international presence in certain world countries. It's as if Serbian media glamorizes Russia as a prop to show viewers how Serbia lost against NATO, but Russia, the hero, still wins and is in charge despite all. But Serbia inflation problems and anxiety persists. Serbia also seems clinging to the past, and in promoting stories and individual recollections of how Serbians were victims of tortures and lies, and how many Serbians were happily married with Muslim ethnic minorities. What will Russia and Ukraine narrate to their peoples via media when this is all over? How would they portray each other, and how would they portray NATO? These are social and moral traumas that can be recounted in many manners, but the reality is that both countries are insignificant in the top richest countries of the West, of the world really. yet are so much better in terms of social state than many other Western countries that relied on slavery, colonialism, and now neocolonialism, yet still remain poor like Portugal and Brazil. Individual greed and corruption never really let the state coffins of Brazil and Portugal be full of Latin America and Angola gold and oil profit. Corruption and individual greed is a trait of Ukrainian economy. So I must ask, how centralizing or decentralizing Ukraine government will help in the broader context of war with Russia without a strict directed international economic orientation by international bodies that can direct but also freeze goods and assets in Ukraine. I suspect this will be the near future and the new focus of NATO and the European Union. But this will not be possible without realizing an ideological, financial and military rivalry between Russia and Ukraine that will allow Russia formal international partners to shift their attention and alliance to Ukraine and drop Russia. BRICS, to me, BRICS, this international institution that we will discuss not in the near future, but we will discuss in 2024, to me represents the perfect platform where Russia will enforce ties with India and South Africa, two traditional neocolonial satellites of Britain in Africa. These forged ties will unavoidably rival with other African countries' trust in Russia, as they struggle with historical scars left by apartheid South Africa government intervention in their countries, and present scars left by Indian Ugandese and Indian Pakistani Muslims in Africa terrorist groups. Russia will be seen as just another neocolonial force, and other former British colonies such as Nigeria will be the first to ring the alarm and recommend other African countries to purchase armament from Poland and other Eastern European countries like Nigeria is doing now. Equally in Asia, China will distance itself from Russia and reapproach Britain to appease tensions over Taiwan, but also because China does not wish to start a trade war with India and other BRIC countries. Our blog is now focused in other countries and conflicts. Finally, throughout this past year, 2023, we made short videos about Africa's coup d'etats and the widespread wave of Islamic groups and bandit terrorist groups in Africa. Also, how countries like Israel failed to expose Hamas racism against African hostages of the 7th of October 2023 terrorist attack. Notably, how Tanzanian students picking fruit in Israel were executed by Hamas as useless prisoners simply because of their skin color. Colorism and racism remains pervasive in Arab countries, and we are yet to know the extent of such in the spread of Islamist groups in Africa. It's all about dehumanization and hate against African skin color, or Libya's slave market selling Nigerian slaves in 2023 are the tip of the iceberg of what lies underneath the Arab world in North Africa and the Middle East. If that is so, what will happen to African nations in 2024 now that Egypt, Algeria and other North African countries are welcoming nuclear energy? Equally, what will happen to African countries now that more and new viruses hit the continent and the food resources do not match the mouths to feed? the same that is happening in Latin America and in Asia. Large amounts of people will want to migrate to the West. This is a clear indication that Prime Minister Tony Blair's globalization dream made sense, and that the World Trade Center international policies made sense. Bin Laden, notorious for the bombing of 9/11, might disagree, but the reality is that makes sense. And now more than ever, he left Labour in America, Democrats and so forth throughout Europe. Left-wing parties will need to change their immigration policies and doctrine to champion the globalization by promoting the return of third-world migrants to their origins. But wait, this is precisely what on the other side of the ocean the African Union is promoting and fomenting at the international level. On our last podcast of the year 2023, titled Free Borders for Migration, we analyzed the design and implementation stages of this two-part international policy involving 36 countries, and what entails in this new stage of the African Union international migration policy framework. But we left out how Western countries will have to actively get involved in this process to make it viable, for the simple reason that Russia is no longer a key player in Africa, nor is China, because both now fear to clash with Islamic groups and spheres of influence, and I'm going to be honest, spheres of influence from India and Middle East in these Islamic groups, Indo-Pakistani and spheres of influence that may drag them into international conflicts adverse to their national interests and problems at home, namely containing the Western culture penetration with consequent erosion of the Chinese and Russian concepts of family unit and traditional gender identities, and glamorization of sexuality and drug use. President Netanyahu of Israel stated that Hamas and friends such as Iran, not in this term Hamas and friends such as Iran, but it was on a broader sense, but seek the return of the period in history where slave trade and Islam were in place and rocking in the world. I believe that Arabs in the Middle East, especially Arabs in Syria, proved that they do not seek such. But let's be honest here. Arabs like Algerians, Tunisians, Egyptians, so racist Arabs, are like President Modi of India. Once their African peers, country leaders, turn their backs, such as the South African leader, they look at them with profound disdain and despise and try to signal to their shocked white Western leaders or counterparts that they are ready to oppress Africans. But they are deluded. This racial hatred is a reflection of their severe inferiority complex in relation to Western culture, which they only associate with racism against Africans, because only in this dichotomy they are seen as white. Otherwise, they are seen as successful Western cultures that in turn reflect the unsuccessful morally, socially, and failed cultures of tribal castes, culture clashes, class rivalries of India, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, to name a few. I believe the way forward for my blog, Ariane Brit Analysis, is to progress towards a think tank group that welcomes other people who wish to volunteer like I do in analyzing contentious international issues, But going a step further, in writing reports about governments in Africa and Latin America, why do I believe Latin America is vital in our future analysis? Because Latin America drug production supply chain is shifting to Africa for consuming purposes, and needs to shift to Africa because fentanyl and other drugs are taking over like speed in the American culture, especially the upper classes. So Africa will need to come up with markets that make cocaine profitable, and this will only be two types of markets for Latin America: human organ harvesting and war gains, such as mines, precious stones. And so Latin American countries will need Africa greatly. They'll need Africa greatly and will promote migration routes to the US and conflicts in Africa, so as to capitalize of supplying Africa prostitution and organs in exchange for the drugs that will permeate countries like Nigeria via the diaspora community and throughout Africa via the belligerent groups that will again be fueled by human trafficking, destitution, and other excluded groups like people who got out of prison. That is why we'll see more conflict and Islamist groups rise in 2024, especially in Africa, because there will be more mobilization and directed direction of drug addicts to and in conflict areas. It is therefore imperative that international migration becomes the focus of 2024, because the Western market of illegal organs and human slavery will boom and materialize in Arab collective revival of racist countries in Africa, such as Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia, but also on the other side of the spectrum, push traditional natural resources away from Africa and trap NATO countries, especially France and allies, to push against Russia and Eastern Europe, because these areas have an equal profile to Africa in mining industries such as lithium and uranium. The African countries in 2024 will have to revise their international ties and counteract by pushing speed westernization. But the question for 2024 is, will this mean peace for all? I suspect that this will not mean peace for all in Africa, because it will feed further the rhetoric that there are puppet governments in Africa, and these people who feed and spread that rhetoric will want weapons and will want financing from anyone, and fast. But Russia and China will not fall for that, because they don't want to have to face whoever is behind these Islamist groups, the Indo-Pakistani groups, and the Arab extremists. They do not want that. Will there be new key players in Africa? I don't think that Israel will want to go there anyway sooner. I think that recycling of resources and redirecting of economies will be something many countries will be looking into, but the reality is that the international migration policies and globalization need to find a common ground, because violence is escalating and violence is not profitable for humanity. Thank you for listening. Please stay tuned for 2024. Have a blessed end of the year. Bye bye. Ariane Denis. Ariane Britoanalysis blog www.arianebritoanalysis.org. Bye bye.